Welcome. In 1998, British historian Arthur Marwick published The Sixties, an almost encyclopedic work of over 800 pages. And when you include the endnotes, the bibliography, and the index, the book finally concludes on page 903. It was not the first academic study of the 1960s, but in both breadth and depth, it was, and will long remain, a definitive work. Perhaps no element of Marwick's study has been more influential than his argument that the 1960s were a long decade. That is, you can't study the 1960s well if you start only in 1960 and then end in 1969. He therefore begins in 1958 and concludes in 1974. In other words, his long 1960s comprises not 10 years, but 16. Today, we'll analyze competing historical explanations of the 1960s. Marwick's dates of 1958 and 1974 require some explanation. To some extent, the answer is found in his focus on four countries: Britain, France, Italy, and the United States. By 1974, there were points of significant convergence across all four nations. Marwick notes the economic crisis that began in 1973 and intensified the following year throughout the world. Also in 1973, the United States legalized abortion, France liberalized its abortion laws, and Italy granted a right to divorce. In 1974, France and Italy lowered the voting age to 18. Britain had already done so in 1969, and the United States did so in 1971 with the 26th Amendment. So again, convergence. But Marwick's start date of 1958 is less obvious. Key here is the publication in 1957 of The Affluent Society by the Canadian-American economist John Kenneth Galbraith. From Marwick's perspective, the economic boom after World War II facilitated the social changes that he begins charting in 1958. It's worth asking, what's included and what's excluded by starting in 1958 and concluding in 1974? Well, for one thing, and perhaps most obviously, this means that, from Marwick's view, the long 1960s does not wholly encompass the civil rights movement. Yes, there is some overlap, but by 1958, for example, Brown versus Board of Education had already happened, as had the Montgomery bus boycott. The civil rights movement really predates the long 1960s. On the other hand, although Marwick's study is international in scope, by going through 1974, his long 1960s includes such contentious developments in the United States as the legalization of abortion. So, it might be that, when looking at the key dates of 1958 and 1974, the latter date is, in some respects, more important for what came after. For example, following Roe v. Wade, abortion became one of the most divisive political issues in the United States. By taking his story through 1974, Marwick's long 1960s model thus encompasses those points of political fracture later known as the culture wars. And, in some instances, the culture wars still define American political life even now, generations later. But the long 1960s is not the only approach or paradigm for thinking about social change during that decade. There is a significant amount of scholarship that focuses not upon a long 1960s, but upon the year 1968. And this has both popular and academic expressions. One popular example is by American author Mark Kurlansky in his book 1968, The Year That Rocked the World. And a good academic example is The Spirit of '68, Rebellion in Western Europe and North America, 1956 to 1976, by the German historian Gerhard Rainer Horn. Horn goes so far as to describe 1968 as a symbol for a larger movement in time. By focusing on 1968, this view draws attention to a year that saw incredible and sometimes tragic change. For example, in 1968, the world witnessed the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. It saw the intensification of the Cold War when the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia. It also saw the eruption of massive, sometimes violent student protests at universities across the globe. And finally, at the end of the year, the world witnessed the first televised transmission of planet Earth from outer space. So yes, 1968 was a massive year, and perhaps no portion of it was more important in retrospect than student protests. Some have looked upon these protests as exercises of popular or direct democracy. Especially popular were utopian slogans such as "Be realistic, demand the impossible." So, from this view, what matters about the 1960s is the crystallization of a particular kind of utopian politics, one given clear articulation in 1968, a year that truly did rock the world. So, what's at stake here? Let's go ahead and zero in on the views of Horn and Marwick. Because Marwick published his book first, we'll start with him. In some ways, his work was quite polemical. He took a special aim at Marxist historians, coining what he termed the great Marxisant fallacy, which he defined as the belief that the society we inhabit is the bad bourgeois society, but that, fortunately, this society is in a state of crisis, so that the good society, which lies just around the corner, can be easily attained if only we work systematically to destroy the language, the values, the culture, the ideology of bourgeois society. And, as he further explained, in reality, the society we live in has evolved through complex historical processes, very different from the Marxist nonsense about the bourgeoisie overthrowing the feudal aristocracy. Here we see a view of the 1960s that chronicles but does not support utopian slogans such as "demand the impossible." But for Horn, it's this utopian drive that makes 1968 worth singling out. The opening lines of Horn's book read, "This is a study of the spirit of 1968. Pride of place is given to the dynamic towards personal and collective liberation unleashed in 1968 and the rise of social movements at this time." He continues, "The most important task remains to rescue these experiments in participatory democracy and the corresponding social struggles from the historical distortion and condescension to which much recent historiography appears to condemn that promising era of revolt." And this is key. Horn isn't just doing history. Rather, it's an attempt at intervention. Put somewhat differently, his book is prescriptive. And this is very different from something descriptive. The prescriptive talks about how things could or should be. Prescriptive discourses are central to ethics, politics, and religion. But the descriptive talks about how things were and are. Descriptive discourses are central to history and the natural sciences. For example, it's one thing to talk about what you did yesterday, and quite something else to talk about what you could or should have done. The first of these is descriptive, the latter is prescriptive. There is a risk here. The prescriptive risks transforming history into a usable past, in which select events are cherry-picked for the sake of scoring political points in the present. Descriptive approaches make this more difficult. So, here's at least one key difference between these two models. Marwick was no conservative, but by not focusing on the utopian element, he makes it harder to transform the 1960s into a usable past. But, for Horn, 1968 is a symbol of something past, but also an invitation to a certain kind of politics in the present. All of this is very broad and perhaps a bit abstract, so let's apply it to something concrete: religion. Hugh MacLeod did so in his book, The Religious Crisis of the 1960s. As he tells the story, both in the United States and in the nations of Europe, in the first half of the 20th century, most people considered their respective nations Christian. And, in the aftermath of World War II, church attendance increased, a phenomenon that MacLeod charts through the late 1950s. But then, around 1958, at the beginning of Marwick's long 1960s, we see a drop in attendance, and as the decade progressed, there was increased variation in the rate of decline when comparing the nations of Europe with the United States. A more rapid drop in church attendance happened in Europe. In some ways, MacLeod agrees with Marwick by emphasizing growing affluence. For example, as more and more people purchased cars, they spent their weekends traveling instead of attending church. From MacLeod's perspective, the long 1960s saw a growing number of alternatives to weekly church attendance. Once taken advantage of, this led to fewer and fewer young people socialized within a Christian environment. He writes, "By the end of the 20th century, these changes had gone much further. The trends established in the long 1960s set the pattern for the rest of the century." But if this seems to confirm Marwick's paradigm, the fact is that, even here, MacLeod can't avoid the view that 1968 was, in some ways, its own kind of moment. MacLeod has an entire chapter devoted to just 1968, but in that year, religious organizations were not the instigators of change. Instead, the developments of more extreme political positions, especially on the political left, served to divide churches just as they divided Western cultures more broadly. But this also means that secularization does not come from political shifts. Rather, secularization and political shifts are like two children descended from the same parent, and that parent is what MacLeod calls the decline in Christian socialization. So what? The paradigm of the long 1960s is now widely accepted. For example, there's an academic journal, The Global 60s, which is the only journal dedicated to the academic study of the 1960s. Notably, its stated aims and scope focus on the long 60s. And if you go to Google Books and type in the long 1960s, numerous studies come up. Marwick's paradigm has been applied to places that he didn't analyze, as in Eric Zolov's book, The Last Good Neighbor, Mexico in the Global 60s. Still others have built on MacLeod's usage of Marwick's thesis to further study religion, as in Clive Field's book, Secularization in the Long 1960s, which invokes both authors. And even Horn's book, despite focusing on 1968, has a subtitle that emphasizes the years 1956 through 1976. This is an even longer time span than Marwick's own paradigm of the long 1960s. Because it's central to the academic journal The Global 60s, and because that is the only journal of its kind, Marwick's thesis has attained a privileged position in contemporary scholarship. And the reason for this is probably pretty simple. We accept paradigms because they help make sense of the world, or, put better, they make better sense of the world than other competing paradigms. The point here is philosophical, and it doesn't just pertain to history. You can think of religion as a paradigm, political values are also a paradigm, and the list goes on. We draw on diverse paradigms in the course of daily life and its many activities. Even if we're not aware of it, we test paradigms, we sometimes revise them, and, when necessary, we discard them for newer, better ways of understanding. Marwick's idea of a long 1960s is unlikely to disappear, at least until a better paradigm comes along. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. To review, Arthur Marwick's study is simply entitled The 60s. It's a very, very big book of more than 800 pages, but it's expertly researched and dispassionately argued. It's an international study analyzing developments in Britain, France, Italy, and the United States. In it, Marwick advances his thesis that the 1960s are best understood as a long decade, beginning in 1958 and continuing through 1974. Next, in his book, The Religious Crisis of the 1960s, Hugh MacLeod applies Marwick's paradigm of a long 1960s to the study of religious belief and practice. He concludes that a decline in Christian socialization led to what is now termed secularization. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button. Feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.